Degreelessness, the only channel that's always right about everything. I'm your host, Shanghai Pete, the People's Champion. Thank you so much for chilling with us tonight. And we begin with a quick recap of only the most fucked shit. Mercifully, it was a pretty tame week in terms of video game news, but even so, right at the top of our list of dumb shit comes the rumor that there might be a PS5 Pro available at launch along with the regular version. Man, I could just say, oh god, please, no, Sony, no. Consoles are not PCs. Get out of here with this shit. The entire reason a console's attractive is because it just all works out of the box. You don't have to fuck with anything. Just plug the shit in, sit on your couch, grab the controller, and play. Alright? And remember, that's coming from me, someone who is an admitted member of the PC Master Race. You know, so consoles are never my first choice, but I do admit they have their uses, and one of those uses is not having a fucking pro version of them, okay? Can we just shut this shit down right now, please? And on the lighter side of things, we did get our first real extended look at The Last of Us 2. This is actually a great example of how actual diversity doesn't need to take away from a game or a piece of media. Sure, in the context of present day, anything as in your face as two girls kissing is going to seem at least a little like wokeness for the sake of wokeness, and I agree, I'm sure there's an element of that in here, but it doesn't strike me as the prime motivation. It seems like a kind of natural extension of Ellie's character. The narrative makes sense, it doesn't seem forced. Or not overtly so, anyway. Just seems like a cool story, so I like the look of this. Awesome work. Still fucking with Naughty Dog. And finally, we must come to the controversy surrounding the Joker movie. Because the insanity and fake outrage narrative constantly pushed by the access media has escalated to such an insane extent that now we have the fucking army warning people about going to see it because of possible violence. Does anyone really think this is fucking helping? Is there any point at which the desire to stoke faux outrage in service of clickbait ad revenue becomes dangerous or at the very least morally irresponsible? I mean, I certainly wouldn't be the one to arbitrate that, but, you know, it's an interesting question to ask, I feel like. Anyway, don't get it fucked up. The only thing that could possibly cause any problems around this movie is the access media constantly pushing unrealistic, exaggerated, and downright false bullshit about it. We all know that. I gotta say, I agree with Matt Stone when he said that journalists writing this kind of garbage are more akin to prisoners writing letters from jail. They have a gun to their head and they're being forced to write shit like this even though everyone knows it's nonsense. I mean, you wanna know what's really dangerous? It's not a fictional movie about a beloved character from a comic book, it's mainstream media being bribed to write increasingly extreme and flagrantly false pieces about it that escalates a false narrative to the point where they're now talking about potential violence. If you're worried that people are so fragile that a fictional movie could inspire violence, what effect do you suppose writing a never-ending stream of articles threatening the same thing would have? Good job, guys, you sure are helping. Imagine if we actually had to hold all media to this insane moral standard the woke media has been pushing. We would have to get rid of virtually all fictional entertainment. Oh, and also, lastly, Call of Duty is Call of Dutying, of course, walling off certain game modes behind a one-year PlayStation 4 exclusivity, which of course makes it useless because COD is a yearly franchise. And, predictably, people are furious. Obviously. For our main story tonight, I thought it'd be fun to have a nice good old-fashioned internet fight. Seems like a lot of y'all really want to fight about this Final Fantasy VII thing. When people say you can never underestimate the ravenous and insatiable thirst fans have for defending their chosen company or brand, they really aren't messing around. My natural inclination is to just rant about my opinions in whatever way I feel like, and if it ends up being combative, even to an unproductive extent, all the better. I mean, shit, who doesn't love pissing people off on the internet? In all seriousness though, I didn't think it was even possible to have such a great comment section brawl with a channel that only has a double-digit sub count. Looks like many of y'all are determined to prove me wrong about that though, and I think that's awesome. At first my plan was to simply just enjoy the chaos and keep it moving, but then the SVP of Creative Development here at Degreelessness suggested that perhaps we should get deep inside this whole thing and try to have a discussion about it. So even though I'm sure people will just downvote any video I put out that features Final Fantasy VII in the thumbnail without watching it, and any attempt to have an actual debate will just result in an insane mess, we're gonna do it anyway. Now, first, before we really get started, I think it's important that I make a few things very clear. Number one, I'm not trying to tell you not to like this. Who gives a fuck what I think anyway? Enjoy what you want to enjoy. I honestly don't give a shit. What I'm trying to do is inform you in the hopes that you don't get fucked over by another AAA publisher that doesn't give a shit about you and will happily rob and deceive you out of every dollar that they can without a drop of remorse. Okay? So, don't get it twisted. Number two, I love Final Fantasy. I have since I was very young. My favorites are 8, 6, 4, 12, and 10 in that order. I mean, I still love the series as a whole too. Well, except for 5, and 2, and 13, and 11, and 15. Well, hell, I'm a fan of Square Enix in general, though. Much less now, however, admittedly. Even though 7 isn't one of my favorites, like most people, I was psyched as hell when they announced the remake. I've said it many times before, and since it seems people's memory lasts less time than it takes to pause a video and scroll to the comment section, I'll repeat it again now. The remake looks incredible. In fact, I'll go a step farther and say even the battle system looks good. The gameplay in general will most likely be pretty fucking good. And as uneven as it was, the gameplay in 15 was great for the most part, albeit if you excuse the combat camera. So no, my problem with this is not the battle system. I even heard something about being able to manually set it back to a classic ATB like the original. Cool. So it's not that, it's not the proposed gameplay either, and it definitely isn't the artistic presentation. My issue with this is far simpler. The remake will not encompass the entire story of Final Fantasy VII. That's the problem. So, before we get into any additional qualifiers, let's take a moment to break down exactly what that means. We're talking about the original Final Fantasy VII, which at the time of its release was a complete game in a single package. It was not a multi-part story released over the course of multiple games or media. Yes, the IP saw multiple additional releases that at times extended and added to the story, but the original Final Fantasy VII was a complete game at the time of its release. There was a beginning, a middle, and a very clear end. The same way Super Mario 3 was a complete game at the time of its release, the same way many other Final Fantasy games were, same as Skyrim, Xenogears, Ocarina of Time, whatever. And before we continue, may I just add that it's positively absurd that the nature of discourse these days is so ridiculous that we have to take the time to do something as insane as defining what the term complete game means. At any rate, we can hopefully agree on the fact that the gameplay and story experience contained in the original release of Final Fantasy VII can henceforth be referred to as a complete game. Thus, it stands to reason that any product that lacks significant parts of that original gameplay, story, and experience could then be defined as incomplete. So, alright, let's further illustrate that point, since it seems some people have a very hard time with that. Let's look at a few of the previously mentioned games. We can all agree, hopefully, that the game Super Mario 3 consists of worlds 1 through 8. By that logic, if the Super Mario All-Stars version of Super Mario 3 contained only worlds 1 through 5, we could unilaterally agree that that would be an incomplete version of Super Mario 3, as it would have been missing worlds 6, 7, and 8. Now, admittedly, it's a little trickier and not quite as cut and dry with an RPG. You could probably endlessly debate what parts of one are technically optional and which aren't, and just what exactly defines the core experience of it. But at that point, I'd say you'd be more in the realm of a semantic argument, more akin to insane mental gymnastics than an actual discussion or debate. Next, let's take a look at Ocarina of Time. The story aside, if you started removing sections of that game, at what point do you suppose would it cease to be complete? Could you take out some of the Kakariko Village parts? Perhaps. What about some side quests? Okay, maybe. But what if you remove the Water Temple? I don't think there's a person on the planet that would argue that a version of Ocarina of Time without the Water Temple could ever be considered complete. Certainly there are people that may enjoy a version of Ocarina sans the Water Temple, but none that would then still call the game complete. Finally, we can extrapolate this fun little mental exercise to Final Fantasy VII. What could you take out of Final Fantasy VII while still being able to call the game complete? Probably the first thing that comes to mind is the Golden Saucer. While there are a few things integral to the plot that occur here, for the most part it's optional minigames. Would a version of Final Fantasy VII without the Golden Saucer be complete? I would argue no, but I do admit there's room to debate that. But what about a version where you don't confront Sephiroth? Where you don't meet Cid? Where Aeris doesn't die? Where you don't go to the City of Ancients or Nibelheim? How far do we go until it's no longer a complete game? This is my point. There are parts of Final Fantasy VII that are critical and integral to the game, to say nothing of the actual end of the story. You cannot remove those parts and still call it a complete game. Therefore, since the Final Fantasy VII Remake ends after Midgar, which we can all agree is not the end of the story or the game, I conclude that it is incomplete, and I thoroughly reject being asked to pay full price for an incomplete game. It is pure, raw, unadulterated, top-shelf, AAA criminal bullshit, and I will not stand for it. And I recommend that you don't stand for it either. It's a cash grab, plain and simple. Let's think about this for a second. Why would Square Enix take one of the most beloved RPGs of all time, a game that upon its initial release included a huge, epic, and more importantly, complete story that offered over 40 hours of gameplay, and then split it up into episodes instead? While there certainly is precedent for games releasing episodically, the amount of times that formula has been applied successfully to a traditional RPG experience, you can count on one hand. Even then, if Square Enix was applying this business model to a new IP or even a brand new game for an existing IP, I could accept that. I probably wouldn't like it or buy it, but I could accept it. That's not what they're doing now. They're taking a complete experience that previously was delivered in a single game and splitting it up into multiple releases. They haven't even figured out how many. Why else would they do that except to siphon as much money out of their customers as possible in a nauseating mimicry of the current standard for AAA monetization? What makes this even more offensive is that they are doing it to a community that they know will not just accept it, but be excited for it and even actively defend it. That's fucking gross, G. Now, you can say this is all fine and that you're okay with it being split up. You can be fine with only playing part of the story, and maybe you even believe Square Enix when they say they'll flesh it out so much that it'll feel like a complete standalone game. That's all fine. But the problem for me is that we know that that isn't the whole story. We know that it doesn't end in Midgar. We know what the end of Final Fantasy VII is, and that isn't it. So don't try to sell me a game called Final Fantasy VII that doesn't end the way we all know that Final Fantasy VII is supposed to end. It's that simple. Shit, call it Final Fantasy VII Gaiden. Call it Final Fantasy VII Abridged. Anything that would indicate that the game contained within is not what we know of as the complete Final Fantasy story. And you know that that deception is intentional because they're marketing this to us as Final Fantasy VII. That is what they're selling us. We know what it is. It's not like it's a new product that they're just saying, oh, trust us, it's going to be good. They're saying, you know what this is. It's Final Fantasy VII. That's why you should be excited for it. While at the same time, secretly knowing that that is not what they're going to be providing us. That's fucked. This shit doesn't even say Part 1 on it. It's practically an exact re-render of the original box art. There's nothing about the marketing or packaging for this that indicates it's an incomplete story or episodic, just simply one part of a much larger whole. A whole, mind you, that they don't even have an ETA for when it'll all be delivered. You think that isn't on purpose? They know that the majority of people that buy this won't even suspect that it doesn't contain the whole story. After all, that's how they're advertising it. In fact, they're fucking counting on it. And I don't want to hear any shit about Advent Children Before Crisis, Crisis Core, or Dirge of Cerberus. The first is a movie, the second is a mobile game for fuck's sake, and the last two feature crudely tacked on stories only tangentially related to the original game. If the remake was going to eventually include the additional story arcs covered in those products, however weak they may be, you might be able to construct an argument however flimsy around that. But it's not. Square Enix have clearly stated that the remake will cover the events of the original game only. The only game that actually matters, the original Final Fantasy VII. You know, there was a comment on one of my previous videos where they said the following. So, what they are releasing for Final Fantasy VII Remake is a full game, but only the first part of the saga. Saying it isn't a full game is like saying the Fellowship of the Ring is not a full movie. Oh boy, dude, you have practically proven my point for me. First of all, you can't conflate those two things because while Fellowship of the Ring is its own book with its own story, it's also the first book in a 3-part saga called The Lord of the Rings. Final Fantasy VII is not a saga, it's not a trilogy, it's a single story and not part of a larger narrative. There is no Final Fantasy VII equivalent of The Two Towers or Return of the King. You can certainly call the story told in Final Fantasy VII a saga, but it's still a single story that ends. It's not one part of a larger, much broader series of events. It is the only story. The Final Fantasy VII Remake ending after Midgar is the same thing as a Fellowship of the Ring movie ending after Frodo leaves the Shire. Now, perhaps you could make a complete movie that ended there, but that movie could not rightfully be called The Fellowship of the Ring, could it? Because it wouldn't be the complete story of The Fellowship of the Ring. The same way a game that ends after Midgar can't be called Final Fantasy VII because that's not the complete story of Final Fantasy VII. How are we even arguing about this? And before we go any further, it seems like a few of you could benefit from a quick history lesson concerning storage media. Historically, since the games industry first embraced optical storage media, no developer has ever been shy about using multiple discs when the content necessitated it. This argument makes even less sense in a time where Blu-ray is the standard for optical media storage. A single layer Blu-ray holds 25 gigabytes, a dual layer holds 50 gigabytes, and a triple layer BDXL format can hold over 100 gigabytes. And that's not even mentioning how common it is for a game to see multiple patches, even day one patches, exceeding 20 gigabytes or more. So no more of this size limitation argument. It doesn't make any sense. And also remember, this is the company that took over 10 years to make the last entry in the Final Fantasy series, and didn't hesitate to shut down and scrap an entire MMO, Final Fantasy XIV, and then completely rebuild it from the ground up. So I don't want to hear any shit about how making the whole game at once would take too long. This is fucking Square Enix we're talking about. They have a practically infinite supply of funds and resources. Ugh, yikes. Alright, let's start wrapping this nonsense up by quoting directly from a recent Square Enix press release. Final Fantasy VII Remake is a reimagining of the iconic original game that redefined the RPG genre, diving deeper into the world and its characters than ever before. The first game in the project will be set in the eclectic city of Midgar and presents a fully standalone gaming experience that provides a great starting point to the series. So, the first thing you want to note here is that they say a reimagining of the iconic original game. Okay, so no more incomprehensible ramblings about how there's multiple parts to the story or that it'll involve multiple games. They say right there, in the first sentence, the original game. Not Crisis Core, not Thrice Damned Before Crisis, or the absurd Dirge of Cerberus. The original game. They then go on to state that it'll be a fully standalone gaming experience that presents a great starting point to the series. This is interesting for a few reasons. First, they've already shifted the language of the marketing to imply that Final Fantasy VII is a series and not a single game. Ooh, I can smell the money already. This is, of course, the rich, creamy center of my problem with this entire clusterfuck of a thing. Games are created with a specific story arc and narrative in place upon which the entire structure and presentation of the game is predicated. I don't believe that can remain intact if you start yanking out parts of it and turning them into separate experiences. You can't do that and then expect them to work as well as the original, even if you then have the audacity to give them the same name. Sure, maybe parts of a single narrative can work as standalone stories, but that doesn't mean they were intended to. That wasn't the way it was envisioned by the creator. You can't expect me or anyone else to believe that the spirit, experience, and vision of the original creation could remain intact after doing that. Lastly, let's address this part where they say a fully standalone gaming experience. I don't have a problem with this. I don't think they're lying or even exaggerating here. I believe every word of this. I'm sure that the game they release next year, called Final Fantasy VII Remake, will be a complete game. A full, maybe even 40+ hour gaming experience. I'm not disputing that. They say it will be a complete game. I agree. That's not the problem. The problem is, that game won't be Final Fantasy VII. It'll have the same name, but it will barely contain a tenth of the game that it's named after. The game whose reputation upon which they're trying to sell this to you. Also, keep that in mind. Think about it like this. Sure, you love all the different parts of a story for their individual merit, but what you are really attached to is the entire thing. All the parts together, the experience. It's like that saying, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. You can't sell me the experience of Final Fantasy VII with just one of its parts, or even all of them, as long as they remain divided up and parceled out piecemeal for the sole benefit of Square Enix's revenue. Final Fantasy VII was not an episodic story. It was not meant to be experienced as a bunch of different games. It was intended to be one game and one story. So, why is it like this? Why can't we have nice things? Well, because at its core, the Final Fantasy VII Remake is nostalgia bait, and all the gaming industry gives a fuck about these days is pushing anti-consumer practices in order to make as much money as possible. Square Enix is very aware that a remake of Final Fantasy VII, called by some the greatest RPG of all time, is one of the most epic events the games industry has ever seen, and it can only happen once. They want to drag this out as much as possible. They need to. How else can they get all the money out of you? Don't get it fucked up, kids. Just like Blizzard finally giving in and making classic WoW, Square Enix is not doing this out of sincere love and affection for the original game as a work of art. They're doing it because throughout the many years that fans have been begging for this, the numbers have never indicated that it would be acceptably profitable. Until now. The only difference is that classic WoW had to be true to the original because that was the entire point. Square Enix didn't have the same limitation on the Final Fantasy VII Remake, however. Oh no! That is why they didn't decide to do it until we had reached an era where loot boxes, microtransactions, and live services are not only generally accepted in the industry, but also, horrifyingly enough, even defended. Some of you know a little bit more about that than others, I think. That's why the Final Fantasy VII Remake will not include the whole game. Because if it did, where's the opportunity to milk the customers for more money? You buy that game for $60, play through the story from beginning to end, that's that. No microtransactions, no DLC, no need to give Square Enix any more money. Just Final Fantasy VII, from Midgar to the center of the planet in the livestream. But that's not how video games work in 2019, is it? So what if instead they split it up, make it multiple parts, add some pre-order bonuses and microtransactions, some cosmetic, and some that maybe aren't. Then they use the first release with an exact copy of the original's box art to fool people and get them hooked on the series. Now that sounds much more like a 2019 game to me. They're dragging this out so much that they don't even know, even right now, how many parts it will eventually be. Think about that. Currently, the length of time that we'll need to see the entire story of Final Fantasy VII portrayed in the remake is indefinite. Sounds much more like a live service game in 2019 than it does a remake of a classic RPG from 1997 now, doesn't it? Why do this? Because Square Enix wants your fucking money. They don't really give a shit about the game they're trying to sell you. Just like every other AAA developer. How sad. Oh, Jesus, this was actually kind of exhausting. Maybe this will be the last time we do something like this. Oddly enough, as I was wrapping this all up, I noticed that Kotaku, of all places, just put out an article saying basically a lot of the same shit I'm saying here. And I'll be honest, it really kind of gives me pause whenever I happen to be on the same side of an issue as Kotaku. Yikes. Hopefully, those of you who made it this far and actually listened to my argument and didn't just downvote the video as soon as you saw the thumbnail and title will forgive me for that. All I'm trying to say is that I don't want to play a version of Final Fantasy VII that doesn't include all of Final Fantasy VII, that doesn't end with a confrontation with Sephiroth on the livestream. You'd think that wouldn't be so controversial. In the end, it's not even something you can be right or wrong about. As I've made pretty clear in this video, the remake is factually not the complete Final Fantasy VII story. That can't be debated. All you can really do is argue about whether or not you think it will be good in spite of that. Ultimately, then that's a subjective question. There isn't really a right or wrong here. So perhaps all we've accomplished is just pissing a lot of people off, which I suppose gives us all something to laugh at, so maybe that can be its own justification. Anyways, that's our show. Thank you for chilling with us tonight. We love you today. We love you all the way. Feel free to call me a fucking donkey in the comments down below, as well as fight with and insult anyone who doesn't agree with you. Hooray! Oh, and I almost forgot, make sure that while you're doing all that, you don't accidentally click the subscribe button, because it's good to be a cynic. It's better to be a contented cat, but it's best not to exist at all.